Hey, this is Sean Shandor from the podcast Thrive Not Survive After Child Abuse. This is already episode number 27. In the last episode, we talked about the importance of the story. And I actually wanted to do maybe a little bit a special podcast today. First of all, I'm also recording it on video. This is the first time that I do that. You won't see that if you just follow the podcast, but if you go to Facebook, I'll put a video recording of that as well. Some people like that. Other people say no, let's not do that. Like it's good enough to hear your voice. Now, yesterday in the podcast, I talked about the importance of storytelling, and in the podcast, actually, I demonstrate a couple of things what the power of the storytelling is. The point here is actually, so I want to continue a little bit on that same topic. The point is actually, yes, storytelling is important, and through the ages, good storytellers have always been very much appreciated. And in time, there was the only way to to bring news or to bring other things over from one place to the other. There was no writing, there was no book printing, and so on. So you have to imagine that was a really important thing. So throughout the ages, and people became really proficient in storytelling, and now storytelling has, of course, become a whole complete different thing. We have movies at the time, we have books, we have now videos, we have phenomena like YouTube. So everyone can be a storyteller. What a lot of people do is they believe they have a message, and I believe a lot of people actually do have a message. I do too, to be honest. And so, if you have a message, it is always best to put it in a good story. That's the point, right? Because then you actually engage your audience a little bit better, and your message often lands better because you have a better listening ear, or and you have an opportunity to put that in some sort of a context, right? So my message actually is I want to raise awareness for child abuse, and that there are so many child abuse victims every day. There are about 1,400 new child abuse victims alone in Europe and in the US alone. So that maybe that sounds like a big deal, but 1,400 is every minute that we talk. I'm talking now 2 minutes and 38 seconds. That means almost three new victims of child abuse. So that's a lot. That's what that number means. So in itself, that is my message, how that is. I want to raise awareness for us. I want to empower people who have been through child abuse, and not only that, I want to empower them that they can go from just surviving in life to a thriving life. So does that make sense? So that is my message. That is my message. But that is not necessarily the story that I tell. I wrote a book, Broken Silence. I hold up now for the people who are watching me on video. I'm holding up the cover right now so you can see it, but if of course if you're only on the podcast, you can see it. But it's Broken Silence. I've mentioned the book several times. I hope it finds a way to someone that you know who could use it, or maybe it is even yourself. We have uh, we have a non-profit organization. It's called Advances Movement to Stop Sexual Abuse. Why Advances Movement? Well, first of all, it is a movement, and secondly, I am a dancer, and so through dance we try to do a couple of things. Again, another message, right? And if I just tell that as a message, you might think, oh, that's very interesting. If I give you a little bit of the background story of it, which is only a part of the story, then it becomes maybe more interesting. So I am a dancer, but it is actually dance that helped me, find the passion in life back, and helped me to express the emotions that I had in a way that worked for me. I'm not saying that you all have to become a dancer, but it is in a way that it helped me. And that's the important part, right? So for me, it was the important part. But so you see, I have a little story. I'm telling you that I'm a dancer, and so hence, I was abused when I was a kid. Dance helped me to get over my abuse, at least for a big part, and I made that part of my story instead of just saying, "Hey, I have a non-profit organization, and it's a really good non-profit organization. It's doing this, this, and this." which is of course really interesting too. But in itself, it's really nice if you see that in a story, right? That's the power of storytelling. Um, in the business training that I gave well, actually, it was only yesterday, and it will be continued in the coming week. Storytelling becomes a really big part also of marketing. And don't immediately hang up, because marketing, of course, it's almost anything that we do is has to do with marketing and sales has often a bad connotation. I do understand that, right? But it's often because the sales situation that you remember are the bad sales situations. The good sales situations that you remember, you probably even didn't recognize them as a sales situation. Yeah, does that make sense? Because you just made a trade, and it could be money for a product, but that means that both parties are happy with it. So that creates a happy situation, or what we call a win-win situation. So you don't recognize that as a sales. You just said, "Hey, we had a good trade. I'm very happy with it, so I was not sold." Right? It could also be, it doesn't have to be a trade for money and a product. It could also be a concept, right? So I'm trying now to tell you a concept that it is important that we keep supporting and trying to raise awareness for child abuse. Now, you might think that's an important topic, but you might not feel immediately some energy around it that you have to do something about it, right? That could be very well true. But if you every time listen to my podcast, you probably are sold that you have to listen to what at least I think are important messages. Does that make a lot of sense, right? So then you are in a sales situation, but you don't even know it because I sold you the concept and you agree with me, right? We both come um, to that thing. So it's telling always. So I was doing storytelling in the context of marketing and sales, and one of the reasons why I was starting to do that is because lately I've been studying, and I've been going to some conferences where I saw a lot of entrepreneurs, and I call myself also an entrepreneur, and I noticed that. Some people think of entrepreneurs often as people that are only in there for the money, and I'm sure there are a lot of people that are in there for the money too, and why wouldn't be? But I think the remarkable thing of the conferences that I have been in, at least, is that most of these entrepreneurs, they have a story to tell. And yes, they get clients, often coaching clients or the clients of an information product, right? Like my book, I'm trying to sell my book in various ways, right? And it's because I believe that has a good message in there. I would not write a book if I don't think that you shouldn't read it. Does that make any sense? So in effect, it's also sales. Now the conferences I've been to, actually you got to learn, you got to work together how to do that in a better way. And a better way is often to reach the audience that you feel are best served with the message, hence the story that I have to tell. So the better I become in telling the stories that are connecting with my audience, the better it is. So in essence, actually, I'm explaining here what the function is of a podcast, at least in the way that I want to do. But yesterday I was telling a story. Actually, I was telling three stories. The first story was about my birthday, and I was thinking about some special things that happened on my birth date, right? Not on my exact birthday, but on my birth date. My birthday is November 9, right? And that's every year. That's a little joke because it's of course not every year, right? It's every year is my birthday is on November 9. And November 9, 1989 was a special day because that was the fall of the Berlin Wall. So I lured people into my story to tell them that I was working on a book that has to do with the history. I was working for a publisher at that time, and it was really important, of course, to get that historical fact into a book that we were producing right at that time. And it was, producing books in 1989 that went completely different than they are right now. So it took a little bit longer, So if you wanted to release a book for BTS, Back to School, then you need to start at a certain time. And actually, you need to start somewhere in November if you wanted to be in time. But we were waiting, let's say, I hope we get a picture of the fall of the Berlin Wall, because if we don't have that in there, we are immediately outdated. So I told that story, and in that story, I had a sub story where I was explaining that teachers who are able to tell good story are the most appreciated teachers by students. It doesn't really matter, but mostly I did a research in elementary school and high school, and that is true for history teachers, but in fact that is true for all kind of teachers. It doesn't really matter, right? It doesn't really matter. So at first we did a research as a publishing house for history teachers, but it's actually true for every teacher as well, and it's also true for all marketeers, and it's basically true for everyone who has a message. That was what I was talking about, right? Second story I told is just a half truth. I was very honest that it's a half truth. I just wanted to make sure that everyone understood how important the message that it was. So I made a fictional story around a fact, a fictional story around a fact. And as long as you're honest around it, it doesn't really matter. It's like you have a movie and there is some sort of a morale in that movie. There's some sort of a message in the movie. The movie doesn't have to be completely factual based, but if the context that you want to bring in is something that you want to do, you put that in a fictional story, as long as you are honest to your audience that the story was actually fictional. Does that make sense? So stories can be both. They can be just for, if it depends on the purpose of delivering a message, right? Now, today I'm going to also be a little bit into the skin of the storyteller. In this case, that is me myself. I am the storyteller. I was telling the story, and there was a third story I talked about yesterday, and that is the story of my book. In my book, actually, I write my story of my abuse and how it affected me, and I've always said a little bit as to maybe not as fun, because that's not the right word, but it is actually the story that's in the front of my book. I never thought it was the most important part of it, but a lot of people, they connected to that story, and it helps them to read the rest of the book. If I only would put the rest of the book in there, right, without skipping the story, people would say, okay, that's interesting, but now they connected to me, to my personal story, and that story is of course factual, or at least that's the way how I see the things, right? So I did that. But while I was telling the story, and one of the things that I try to teach people in my book is the importance of telling a story for child abuse survivors. I went a little bit over it quite fast yesterday because it was in the time that I had allotted to my Instagram live and to my podcast. But now we take a little bit time of what actually happened. I was telling my own story a little bit. That's in the book. I didn't tell my story, but I told that the story is in my book, and the important things that I try to teach in my book. And one of the things is how you tell your story as a child abuse victim. And what I mean with that is not to get attention, it releases something. It's one of the hardest things for child abuse victims to do is in the end to tell their own story to someone else. It doesn't always have to be immediately to someone very close, but it's the first step. Could be the therapist, could be the coach, could be just a close family member that they trust. So I did an earlier podcast that if you are chosen, so to speak, to have that story told to you, you need to see that as an honor, and you need to be very special. Take all the time with about that, and clean out your the rest of your day if you have to, and so on and so on. So that's a different podcast. But now I was saying how important it is for the child abuse victim to tell that story. And what that means is it's a very important step in, if you want to call it that way, in the healing process for a child abuse victim. Arguably, you could say that's maybe the most important one, is that that a child abuse victim knows how to tell the story and again, and it gets better and better. The first time you tell it, often you get very much triggered, or you tell it with a lot of distance, right? So you're not connected to the story. There are two things happening in that story. I don't want to go too technical. In For a child abuse victim, it's actually you need to be able to tell the story, but at the same time, you also don't want to stay and be the story, right? You are the, it happened to you, but it's in the past. But while I was telling this, something came over me, so to speak. While I was telling this, I got an inspiration of that I had to tell more. And this is what I want to tell. This is what I want to tell to you guys if you're listening and you're interested in bringing your message to the world. Sometimes when you start to use your voice, right? And it's in if you believe in chakras and you know how that works, it's in your throat chakra. You open that up, you get a flow almost from outside. You get an inspiration. So how that flows. Does that make sense? It's not only that you have your story right, you write it down, and then you do it scripted. That could be a really good way to learn it. But if you know how to do it at some point in time and it's more intuitive, you get more in your story than you yourself actually know, and sometimes you feel very inspired by it yourself, how strange it is. And that happened yesterday. I was telling the story. I hope you go back to that episode. But I told someone, it's the first time actually I told it someone, is why it's so important for a child abuse victim to tell the story. I wanted to go a little bit more technical, as I just did with you, but I actually came to something that later on in the chapters of my book I will describe something about that. It's also about the release of energy. But it's a release of energy because it was held under a lid, right? It was held under lock and key, so to speak. And every time, that is not only true for child abuse victims, but it is specifically true for child abuse victims, everything when we keep a secret in ourselves, something bad is going to happen with us. It stirs up and it keeps us, it affects our heart, it affects our mind, and it actually affects your physical and mental health. If you keep secrets in yourself for too long, it works on you, right? And I know that I just never talked about it so much, but I want to make sure that you all understand how important that is. So that inspiration to tell that came at the same time while I was doing my podcast and my Instagram live. But here's the thing: if you think about it and you believe in what I call a sense of being, which is the fifth energy that I talk about in my book, that everything is connected, and you think about the number of child abuse victims that are in the world, right, and coming into the world every day, every minute one, that is 600,000 new victims every year. Now, if you calculate that throughout the years, that is tremendous. Number shows that it is 1 out of 3 women have been affected by some sort of a form of abuse. That is more than only child abuse, but nevertheless, right? And keep that often as a secret. For men, numbers is a little bit lower, but still high enough to have that number in there. And that is the secrets only from the victim point of view, and it means we keep a lot of that energy in ourselves. And I never knew how important the message that I was bringing here. How that I never knew actually that that's maybe the reason why I call it broken silence. We need to break the silence not only for the victim themselves but also for all of us together, because we keep that secret down, and keeping that secret down affects you as a person if you're a victim, but it also affects the people obviously around you. That is one of the reasons why we cannot, hold our relationships, because we keep things in ourselves. Does that make sense? Right? And if you do that for years and years, you can only imagine, if you have any feel for that, if this is, something that doesn't talk to you, that's great. I'm okay with that. But I felt very inspired to do more around this thing. Is that is what we need to stop, right? So without knowing, I already started also another movement. Is, we have one story less to tell. Every story that you tell is one story less to tell. and we feel very strong about it to start that movement and do that stronger. So I'm not sure if I made a lot of sense today. I try to do this podcast a few times more so that it becomes a little bit better, to be honest, maybe from a slightly different context. But I feel very inspired, and strange as that is, I mean, it's definitely strange for me to do that because I am the writer again for this book. I held it up now like 4 times. It feels like a commercial. It's but I feel lately very inspired by my own book and see the importance why I needed to bring that to the world. Actually, for me, writing that book, that felt as an inspiration to do that. It was a personal choice, obviously, but I never fully understood why I had to do it. I had a lot of pain and treatment through it in bringing that to the world, but more and more I understand how important it is. And when you, as I do, have a message and you feel that other people can benefit from the message, you need to learn how to tell your stories. Do it through a podcast, and maybe the podcasts are like me, not immediately so wonderful. But if you can do it like this and they become wonderful, you reach more audience, and that would be a good thing. So this was Sean with the podcast Thrive, Not Survive After Child Abuse. The topic of today was again storytelling, a little bit more from the inside. I hope to hear you back tomorrow, and from now on, actually, I can also say see you back because I'll put it on video from now on as well. All right? Okay, this was Sean. Bye bye.